The Mongols had fallen just as deep as they had risen. The descendants of Genghis were fractured from within, and by the dawn of 1444, the Oirat had subjugated the Mongol tribes. However, the Oirat didn't dominate without opposition. Taisun, the leader of the subjugated Mongols, was an ambitious leader seeking to reclaim the lost glory of his people. But before he could storm the steppe, he needed to vanquish the scourge to his west. While Taisun didn't want to recognize the Ming who had usurped the Chinese throne, he reluctantly accepted to do so in the short term to lead his independence war against the Oirat. He placated his tribes with numerous benefits and exchanges and sent an embassy to Beijing, which was welcomed by the emperor. Taisun patiently waited for the Ming to see him more favorably, and he offered many promises to become their tributary. Since the Ming was having a hard time curtailing the influence of Oirat to their north, they eventually agreed to form an alliance with Taisun against his overlord. On January 13th, 1447, Taisun formally declared war on his overlord, Esen Taishi of the Oirat. While Taishi wasn't surprised that the Mongols would rebel, he was bewildered that they had the support of the Ming on their side. And now, Taisun could call 60,000 of his Chinese allies into the war against the Oirat. So, the Mongol army marched westward into Oirat territory. Kobdo was besieged, while the Oirat attempted dangerous maneuvers around the Chinese armies, including attempts to march through Siberia. But the resistance was in vain. While there were some successes for the Oirat army, Kobdo fell and Esen Taishi was captured. Esen Taishi was forced to let go of the Mongols, as well as conceding all of his territory bordering the Ming except for the isolated border province of Alxa. Taisun's popularity soared among his tribes, and though some anti-war tribes had revolted, Taisun was seen in his country as a great liberator and conqueror, despite bending the knee to the Ming and agreeing to pay tribute to the emperor. Exploiting the newfound loyalty towards him, Taisun moved his armies to the east and declared war on Korchin. While the Korchin were themselves Mongols, they hadn't been under Taisun's sovereignty in any way, unlike the other tribes under the Mongol banner. And while Taisun and the Mongols wanted Korchin to be absorbed entirely into the united Mongol state, Taisun would let the Korchin remain independent by the war's conclusion. Taisun's army moved to besiege Korchin and their Jurchen ally in Donghai. Taisun made a conscious decision to force the Donghai to break their alliance with the Haishi. While the war council was confused, Taisun said that it would make sense soon enough. With the Korchin fully occupied, Taisun absorbed most of the state except for a few northern towns. Despite his immense popularity, the rapid rise of the Mongols might have been perceived as a threat by the other tribes of the steppe, and because of that, Taisun was careful in his expansion. With his new lands to the east, Taisun burned Korchin. The armies plundered the towns for days, and the loot was divided up between the soldiers, the tribes, and Taisun himself. And yet again, Taisun declared war on the Jurchen tribe of Haishi, the same nation that he forced the Donghai to break their alliance with earlier. Haishi had no allies to call upon in defense against Taisun, who forced the entire tribe into his realm. Taisun took a particular interest in Haishi for two main reasons. The first was that these Jurchen people had something he didn't: feudalism. While other societies had an advanced social structure with a well-defined authority, the Mongols were more of a loose confederation rather than a single state. Taisun hated this fact and wanted to tighten the control of the Khan over the tribes. And so, inspired by the system of Jurchen tribes, Taisun began a gradual shift towards the consolidation of the 1,000 Mongol tribes. Taisun introduced the system slowly. He carefully balanced appeasing the chiefs and taking more powers for himself, usually by promising chiefs positions of nobility in exchange for growing powers. But with a few bumps and bribes, Taisun would have every Mongol tribe under his unquestioned sovereignty by approximately 1460. However, Taisun wasn't done with the Haishi. He knew something was missing. Merchants from the west spoke of a dramatic shift in artistic and cultural expression, and while he had little idea on what this western shift was, he was inspired to create something similar for the Mongols. And so, while not proclaiming Girin as his official capital, he directed all state resources and assets towards its development. Soon enough, it became an important cultural and scientific hub on the steppe, with the majority of Mongolia's scholars and philosophers being there. And while this effort wasn't as efficient as the birth of Mongolian feudalism, Girin would eventually contribute to the rapidly rising fields of Mongol science and philosophy. This period saw the Mongols at peace with their neighbors, but the army did have to put down several revolts from the hordes and newly subjugated tribes. But since the Mongols were a horde on the steppe, their economy was sustained only by war. On the dawn of winter 1459, the Mongols invaded the tribe of Udege, despite their alliance with the Oirat. The Mongols were a little tied up fighting a two-front war, but they pulled through and forced Oirat out of the war. But before Udege was annexed and plundered, Taisun declared war on the Khalkha. The Khalkha were a Mongol tribe who had broken away from the Oirat, but seeing that they had no defenses for their new nation, Taisun incorporated the tribe into the official Mongol state. And now, Udege was incorporated, after the Mongols declared war on Solon. But instead of annexing and razing, the Mongols did things a little differently with the Solon. The chief was granted amnesty, and in exchange, he would rule over his people as a vassal of the Mongols. This gave him much more autonomy than a tribe within the Mongol state itself, but he was still dependent on Taisun. But there was a little problem. While the Mongols and Solon were still officially at war, the neighboring tribe of Yeren had declared war on Solon. Now that Solon was a Mongol vassal, Yeren was now at war with the entire Mongol state. But not only was Yeren now at war with the Mongols, since Yeren was technically attacking, the Great Ming now came in the defense of their tributary. And while the Mongols could defend themselves against these tribes alone, Taisun welcomed the excessive help of the Ming. Taisun didn't take any land from his attackers, simply demanding a large contribution of much needed cash. But after the war, Taisun sadly died at the age of 52 in his army camp. His brother... Agvarjin succeeded him, though he was 50 at the time of his coronation. But there was a new threat on the steppe. Chagatai had exploited the fall of Oirat, and now threatened Mongol rule over the steppe. In response, the Khan ordered his best emissaries to stay at the court of Transoxiana, a rival of the Chagatai, in hopes that the two nations could ally against their mutual enemy. During a visit to Samarkand, the Khan would have a child named Kaishan, and while the Khan would return to Mongolia, he left his son behind in the care of the Mongol embassy. With his childhood surrounded by diplomacy, he would grow up to be a significant diplomat himself and a firm negotiator. Transoxiana would eventually agree to ally the Mongols, but the Mongols wanted to further strengthen their position against Chagatai. So in 1470, war was declared against the rump state of Oirat, and though they were a shadow of their former glory, the Mongols turned the tables and subjugated them. Despite the Oirat only existing in a string of mountain towns, they laid claim to a significant portion of the steppe. This would soon be exploited against Chagatai and their tributary of Buryatia. With tensions between the Mongols and Chagatai at their peak, war broke out between the two khanates in October 1472. The First Great Steppe War had just begun, and it wouldn't conclude until 1480, over 8 years later. This war would consist of two phases, the first of which was conducted directly between the Mongols and Chagatai, with Transoxiana participating throughout the first phase. The Mongol army of 16,000 entered Chagatai territory and laid siege to Kobdo, originally an Oirat fort, and Urumqi, the capital of the Chagatai. Because of Nogai entering the war on the side of Chagatai, Transoxiana was tied up with them, while the armies of Chagatai and the Mongols clashed on the steppe. But with a little luck, the Mongols won Kobdo and Urumqi, and moved to relieve their besieged capital. While Abargjan was slightly outnumbered, he demonstrated the importance of shock and cavalry warfare on the steppe by routing the besiegers of his capital. After the retreat of their shattered army, Chagatai regrouped in a counterattack for Urumqi, but of course, they were unsuccessful. The Mongols pushed deeper into Chagatai's territory before reaching the fort of Chokor, the last Chagatai stronghold. The remnants of the Chagatai army had retreated into the untouched Yarkand, a vassal of the Chagatai. Agbarjin would have contributed his campaign into Yarkand, but he feared further damage to his delicate economy, so he pressed the Chagatai for peace and restored all Oirat land under his vassal. The Khan also captured large amounts of the Chagatai treasury. With that, the first phase officially concluded, but this wouldn't be the end of the Great Steppe War. Rather, with the end of the first phase, the second phase would start to begin. Just 3 months after the Mongols had forced Chagatai to peace talks, the tribe of Buryatia was declared upon. Buryatia had acted as Chagatai's tributary in the power vacuum of Oirat. Effectively a puppet state, Buryatia was reliant on defense from Chagatai, and especially against the ambitious Mongols. So when war was declared, the Chagatai had no choice but to defend their tributary. The Mongol armies occupied the treacherous mountains of the area, all while skillfully evading enemy armies. The Khan had instructed his armies to plunder their occupations. Though this was a more traditional way of securing wealth, the Mongols desperately needed this cash with their economy still relatively primitive. But the Mongols couldn't idle the entire war. After the capital of Buryatia fell, the army moved to intercept various enemy advances, as well as liberate some captured Oirat towns. The Mongols returned to the walls of Urumqi, the same city that fell to them just 4 years earlier. Chagatai was exhausted. They had no time to recover from the first humiliating defeat, and were now being defeated at every major engagement, except for one Mongol slip-up. And despite hiring every local band of mercenaries, Chagatai just couldn't resist their eastern foe. Despite the Mongols' great advantage, Agvarjin offered the Chagatai a little mercy at the table. He had been experiencing fevers constantly and knew he would pass soon, but he was also still exceptionally greedy. Knowing of his passing, he allowed the Chagatai Khanate to remain independent and mostly intact in exchange for some money. And with Buryatia overlord now out of the war, they were fully absorbed into the Oirat Confederation. The Mongols were now in a strong position. With their rivals in Chagatai defeated, their position on the steppe was unquestioned. They had the Ming to their south as protection, as well as the Solon and Oirat on their east and west flanks respectively. During the second phase of the Great Steppe War, a major revolt of the Jurchen Jousting tribe in the east occurred. Because the Mongol army was preoccupied on the western front, the Jousting had basically lived as a fully independent state for a good few months. But as a show of protection, the Ming had interfered and put down the Jousting revolt on behalf of their Mongol tributary. This just demonstrated how secure the Mongol state was. They were protected on all sides and had bested their main steppe rival. But just as they had triumphed against their adversary, another one popped up. The Korean state had been expanding into Manchu territory, much to the dismay of the Mongols. And just like how the Mongols in Chagatai competed for dominance over Oirat, so too will the Mongols in Korea compete for dominance of Manchu. But that's for the future. For now, Agubarjin remains frail, and his son is recalled from Samarkand. His father may pass at any moment, but will Kaishan be able to keep the Mongols united? Will he keep the Mongols united just like his predecessors, or will the Mongols fade into history once more?